And so what we want to ask is, are systems robust? Are they resilient to these sorts of change? And this is where ecologists have spent a lot of time thinking about, to what extent can different species survive increases in temperature? And then if you get wipeout of particular species or knockout of species, will the system hold together? Another thing was trauma, right? So these are sort of major events. So here's Cortina, where you get the entire, city underground, right, or underwater. This is a case that I think resilience is probably very hard to maintain. And then the last one, and this is, I think, one of the trickiest ones, is this notion of internal dynamics. So these charts here, these are leverage ratios for firms that got TARP money. And a leverage ratio is basically sort of, how much you've got out there in assets relative, how much you've got out there in terms of, money, things you're invested in versus how much assets you've got behind. So it's sort of, if it's 30, that means you've basically got 3% down on your mortgage, right, and you owe 96%. And so what you see is all these banks were sort of playing around with leverage ratios around 15, 20. Some were higher than 20, 25. And everybody started just creeping up a little bit. Because everybody realized, boy, the more we leverage, the better we do. And if you talk to people at Merrill Lynch, it's interesting because they'll say, they were only leveraged at 20, which means 5 to 1, right? So they had 5% down, 95% basically hoping things would go their way. And people kept coming into Merrill Lynch saying, look, we want the same returns that people are getting at Morgan Stanley. And so Merrill Lynch said, okay, well, we're just going to then start leveraging more. But the thing is, as people started leveraging more, what happens? You created a system that collapsed under its own weight. So one of the things that's most important to think about human systems is making sure that they're resilient to these internal dynamics. Okay, so what do people know? So these are the sort of the things that we think about when we think about resilience to what. But then there's a question of, do we know anything, right? So all these physicists, all these engineers, all these ecologists, all these people who design cities, have we learned anything, right? Can we say anything about what makes a system resilient? And the answer here is sort of yes and no. What's intriguing is there's a lot of really technical mathematical papers where they'll show you sort of optimal resilience in this very constrained system. And there's a lot of big think thought pieces. And in terms of the nouns and verbs that these people use, they line up pretty well, right? And so we have some core ideas, but I think it's still fair to say that we don't have as deep a general theory as we'd like. So what I want to do is I want to walk through what I think are sort of the main lessons that we have. And these are going to align with both what Peter and Tom put up in terms of how we think about creating and constructing resilient systems. So here's one thing we know, and we know it happens, but we don't know the conditions under which it happens. So this is what we call a phase transition. So before I explain this graph, let me describe a phase transition the way an ecologist would. So if I have a nice, what we call an oligotrophic lake, which is a beautiful crystal clear, blue lake, and I have the people around that lake start putting nitrogen on their lawn, what's going to happen is that nitrogen is going to flow into the lake, and it's going to get absorbed by the bottom sediments. And as the bottom sediments absorb this nitrogen, the algae and the other plants on the bottom of the lake are going to grow a little bit bigger, and the fish will have a little bit more food, and that'll wipe out the nitrogen. Everything will be fine. The lake will stay nice and blue. And as I keep adding more nitrogen, it's going to stay blue. It's going to stay blue. It's going to stay blue. But as I turn that dial past a point, all of a sudden, there'll just be too much nitrogen in the bottom sediment. There'll be too much algae. The fish won't eat it. And the lake will just go boom and turn into a green, mucky, marshy mess. And so what you don't get is you don't get this sort of smooth, gradual chart where it just goes from blue to blue, green to green. You get something that stays blue, stays blue, stays blue, and then boom, it suddenly becomes green. So a phase transition is something that happens really fast. So here's a graph of a phase transition in traffic. What you've got is you're increasing the density of traffic here, and here we're measuring mobility. There's lots of reasons why we care about other things like access and stuff like that as opposed to mobility, but again, this is the sort of constrained mathematical model, right, that the physicists write. So as you increase density and you look at flow, what you see is, obviously the more density, the more flow, things go up, really nice and fast and everything's wonderful. But at some point right here, you get the phase transition. You see this line heading down the other way where you start seeing traffic jams and the like, and you move from what they call sort of a laminar flow, right, this smooth flow of cars, into this chunky, discrete traffic jam-like mode. So you get this phase transition. And there's all sorts of nice simulations. You can go to this program called NetLogo, and you can just turn the dial for density of traffic, and you can watch the phase transition occur. You can watch it go from smooth traffic to a giant traffic jam. So we know phase transitions exist, but we don't have a comprehensive theory as to what makes some systems have phase transitions and other systems not. A second thing we know, or we sort of know, is that there are some systems that self-organize into critical states. So there's a wonderful book by Wallace Stegner called Angle of Repose, and that's the thing to sort of have in mind. The angle of repose is basically this. if I drop grains of sand, from above a table, eventually I'll get a nice sand pile, and that's what figure A represents. And then this gets C and D, we'll ignore B. Well, as I drop these things, what's going to happen is at some point, when something hits, it's going to cause a little cascade, right? So we'll get these like sort of beads of sand falling on the ground. Well, if you do really careful physical analysis of these things, and if you do nice mathematical models of these things, what you find is if you have a constant rate of dropping the sand, you don't get a nice bell curve in terms of avalanche sizes. So when Tom was talking about this move away, Nicholas Taleb, the black swan, this move away from bell curves and towards sort of large event sort of things, self-organized criticality says if you have a sand pile and you keep dropping sand, what you get is not a normal distribution. You get a long-tailed distribution. So what that means is, to quote the Boomtown Rats, most days nothing happens. So it's day after day of nothing happened today, and then eventually, boom, huge event that nobody anticipated. So one of the things that people are trying to understand, that people sort of do the science of complexity at places like Michigan and Santa Fe, is what is it that makes a system susceptible to phase transitions, and what is it that makes a system self-organized to critical states? Because not everything self-organizes to critical states, but a lot of things do. And one could have argued, some people have argued, that the recent financial system is a case of self-organization to a critical state. And there's a lot of really nice models by Kai Nagel showing that traffic systems actually self-organize to critical states because people end up putting spacing between the cars at just a level so that most of the time traffic goes fine, but some of the times you get these big jams. So here's sort of the two things lurking in the background, these sort of phase transition things and self-organized criticality. Now there's a question of sort of what makes resilient systems, okay? And now here we've got about 5 or 6 lessons. So one of them is multiple paths matter a lot. So diversity in routes, diversity. And so when you think about routes, I'm not just thinking about transportation system. I'm thinking about any sort of ecological system. You've got energy flowing between things. Any sort of economic system, you've got money and goods flowing between things. So what you need is you need multiple routes. So here's sort of your standard, 5th, 6th grade issue about what they call a trophic web. Actually, in college you call this a trophic web. If you're in high school, you call this a food web, right? But what this is this is just sort of what I like to call who eats whom graph, right? Now, when I was in middle school, they had these things they called keystone species. And this is before they had really good data on what these webs look like. And a keystone species was a species that was the only species at its trophic level. So that means it was the only thing that ate the stuff below it, and it was the only thing that was eaten by the things above it. And the idea was if you had a keystone species and that got knocked out, the whole ecosystem would fall apart because the things above it would have nothing to eat, and the things below it, nothing would eat. So everything above would die and everything below would just take off. Keystone species has sort of fallen out of favor because when you actually do these graphs, you find that there really are no keystone species. Everything's connected to everything else in such a way that these systems have multiple paths, and that's why ecosystems are around. In some sense, the ecosystems that had keystone species maybe don't exist anymore, right? The evolution's had a long time to work on these problems. And so the reason ecosystems are as resilient as they are is because of this multiplicity of paths. A second thing, and this is a book by a scholar who I'm married to, which is great. My wife wrote a book called The Robust Federation, and what she talks about, she studies why the Articles of Confederation failed and why the U.S. Constitution worked. And one of the things that's interesting here is multiple responsiveness. So when you think about diversity, we need sort of multiple canaries in the coal mine. So when you think about the government, doing something that's improper, what are the responses? Well, we have the courts, we have the press, and we have the people. And each one of those responds in some ways to different sorts of, so each one of those responds in different ways to some sort of action. So if the government imposes a new health care bill or decides to pass a new health care bill, there can be a public response that could kill that, or the courts could kill that, and usually the reasons are different. So there are different types of canaries. So having different types of canaries that give different coverages to different problems allows a federation to stay robust. There's a lot of very nice work, and this is probably the best work, and this comes from, in terms of how tightly done it's done, and this gets to Peter's thing about the badlands and the rugged landscapes, on the importance of variation for resilience. So if I think about, sort of having the optimal solution to something, but then there being some sort of shift in the parameters, what I'd like is a lot of variation so that when I shift, I've got something sort of at that point. So it's important to distinguish between diversity, which means different types, and variation, which means sort of changes within the type, right? Just sort of variation within that type. And variation is incredibly important, right? In terms of having, like, for an auto company, you need a variation in terms of the fleet of the cars you've got. So if gas prices change or if safety considerations change, you can respond to market demand. The same's true at the system level. This is a slide in honor of my friend Bobby Lowe.